What's your relationship with your siblings like? Close, distant, complicated?
So, on New Year's Eve, while most people were clinking glasses and making those overconfident toasts about how next year was going to be our year, I was sitting at my parents' kitchen table with a half-full glass of cheap champagne, trying to figure out if I had just misheard my own mother, or if she had actually just told me, in the middle of a family gathering, that I needed to pack my things and stop relying on them. At first, I genuinely thought maybe she was making some awkward attempt at humor, the kind of thing you say with a smirk because you think it's witty, but it's really just uncomfortable. But then I saw my dad give this slow, deliberate nod, like they had rehearsed it beforehand, and I felt this strange mix of shock and anger starting to rise. I mean, I'm 35 years old, I've had my own career, my own bills, and my own life for a long time, but for the past 8 years, I've also been paying their power, their water, and their internet directly from my own accounts, not lending them money, not covering a bill here and there, but actually setting it up so it was withdrawn every month without them even seeing the transaction, because back when my dad's hours got cut and my mom had medical expenses piling up, I thought that's what family did. And now here they were on New Year's Eve, telling me with straight faces that I needed to find somewhere else to live, as if I was some mooch they'd been reluctantly tolerating. I just sat there, swirling the champagne in my glass, trying not to let my face give away too much, because I didn't want to have some big emotional scene in front of the handful of relatives and neighbors still lingering in the living room. My mom kept talking like nothing she had just said was completely insane, rambling about how it's time to be independent, and you can't live here forever, and the absurdity of it hit me so hard I almost laughed. Independent? I had been the one making sure their lights didn't get shut off when they forgot to pay the bill, the one covering the water when the notice came in with those big red letters, the one paying for the internet so they could keep watching their shows and video calling their friends. They hadn't been supporting me. If anything, I had been subsidizing their ability to act like they were financially stable. I didn't say any of that out loud yet, though, because I knew how that game worked. If I said it then, they'd get defensive, they'd twist my words, they'd try to paint me as ungrateful for letting me live there, conveniently ignoring the fact that if I had moved out years ago, they would have had to pick up those bills themselves and probably downsize their whole life. Instead, I just nodded slowly, like I was taking in what they were saying, and asked when they thought I should be out. My dad shrugged and said something like, "as soon as possible," in that tone he uses when he wants to sound casual, but is actually pushing for it to be immediate. That's when something in me clicked. I realized I had two choices. I could either get defensive and let them control the narrative, let them tell everyone they finally pushed me to stand on my own 2 feet, or I could flip the whole thing back on them so hard they'd have no idea how to spin it. And the thing about me is, once I make up my mind about something like that, I'm already 10 steps ahead before the other person even realizes there's a game being played. So I smiled, genuinely smiled, and said, "All right. I'll start packing tomorrow." My mom looked almost relieved, probably thinking I'd taken it well, which made it even better. I clinked glasses with her like we were making some friendly agreement, but in my head, I was already running through every bill in my name that was linked to their address, every monthly auto-pay that kept their life humming along without them having to think about it. As the night went on, I stayed quiet, just observing, catching little side comments they made to people about getting Laura to finally fly the nest and helping her start fresh. It was almost comical hearing them talk like they'd been carrying me all this time, and I think that's when the anger solidified into something sharper, not rage, but resolve. They wanted me out? Fine. But they were about to get the version of out that came with a reality check attached, one they couldn't dodge with half-truths and pity stories. By the time midnight rolled around and everyone was hugging and shouting Happy New Year, I'd already decided exactly what I was going to do when the sun came up. It wasn't going to be loud, it wasn't going to be dramatic in the moment, and it definitely wasn't going to be something they could undo with a phone call. It was going to be clean, controlled, and hit them exactly where it hurt, not in their wallets, because I knew they'd find a way to spin that too, but in their comfort zone. I was going to take away the thing they didn't even realize they depended on the most, and I was going to do it without a single argument. So I stayed through the end of the party, smiled for the photos, even helped clean up the kitchen afterward, because I knew the contrast was going to make what came next feel even sharper. And as I lay in bed that night, hearing the muffled sound of their TV in the other room, the TV that was connected to the internet I paid for, I couldn't help but think, this is going to be fun. And right there, I decided exactly how the next 24 hours were going to go. The next morning, when the house was quiet and I could hear that particular stillness that settles after a night of noise and performance, I made coffee I barely tasted and sat with my laptop like it was a witness. Because I knew if I didn't ground myself in facts, I would either start second-guessing what happened or let them pull me back into that old loop where I explain and justify while they nod, and then do whatever they planned anyway. So I opened the accounts one by one and looked at the trail I had created without even thinking of it as a trail. The electricity that had switched to autopay the year my dad's hours got cut. The water that I took over after my mom called crying about a late notice with those big red letters. The internet that I set up in my name because theirs was suspended for non-payment and the provider would only start a new contract with a clean account holder, and I pulled bank statements for every year since then, and I watched the column of debits stack into something that, if I were less angry, might have made me cry, because no one should have to prove they were decent, and yet here I was, itemizing basic decency to defend myself against my own parents' story about me. I scrolled through the old texts for context, those small messages that say everything without saying it, like the time my dad wrote, "Can you spot us just this once? We'll pay you back on Friday," and then Friday never arrived, not that week and not any week after. Or the time my mom said, "We tried to pay the internet, but it bounced again. Can you fix it? I hate being on hold." And I remember leaving my desk at work and standing in the stairwell with customer service on one ear and a client on the other, juggling two situations because I had learned, slowly and painfully, that if I didn't step in, the fallout landed on me anyway in the shape of guilt and accusations about being ungrateful. And as I read, I realized something almost funny in a bitter way, which was that I had been so efficient and so quiet about keeping their house running that they had come to see it as the natural order of things. Like bills just live on my card the way pictures live on a wall, and because it was invisible, they could tell a different story to everyone else about who needed whom. The realization that hit me hardest wasn't the money, though the money would make any reasonable person blink. It was the way they had rewritten the history out loud, because I had overheard my mom at holidays talk about giving Laura a place to get back on her feet, as if I had stumbled in from some disaster rather than been asked to move in after their budget blew up and they were falling behind. And I had watched my dad shrug and say, "She's working on it," when a relative asked how I was doing, as if I were a long project they were managing instead of a daughter who, quietly and consistently, had been managing them. I thought about the times I cut back on things that would have made my life easier, not because I couldn't afford them in theory, but because I kept a mental tally of their needs and I tried to stay ahead of those needs like a responsible adult. And it dawned on me that the story they were telling wasn't just inaccurate, it was useful for them, because if I was the dependent one, then whatever I did to keep them afloat could be framed as me paying my way, which meant they didn't have to feel grateful or accountable or even honest. That was the moment I knew the conversation I had been rehearsing in my head, the one where I laid it all out and demanded acknowledgement, was pointless, not because they were evil, I don't think they are, but because it would ask them to give up a version of themselves they like, and people will do almost anything not to let go of a flattering mirror. So instead of planning a confrontation, I planned a demonstration. Not loud, not dramatic, just unmistakable. Because the only thing that changes a story people cling to is a fact they cannot ignore, and the cleanest fact available to me was the one I had been underwriting all this time. I started a simple ledger in a spreadsheet, month by month, with lines for the power, the water, the internet, and all the small add-ons I had absorbed without thinking. Like the security subscription my dad swore was essential and the streaming bundles my mom signed into with my card because the family logins were on my email, and I put next to each charge the text receipt or the confirmation email. Not to wave in anyone's face, but because I wanted to remove any chance that I would wobble when the pressure started, and I knew there would be pressure because there is always pressure when you stop performing a role people think you owe them. I totaled the years and wrote a short, plain note to myself that said, You did this because you believed in family, not because you were forced, and that sentence steadied me more than the sum, since the sum, however big, was just fuel, while the sentence was direction. And because I promised myself that every step from now on would carry a consequence they could feel, even if it was small, I picked a target that would sting without causing harm. Something that would mark the shift and force them to notice it in their bodies the way you notice a missing ring or a tooth. So I opened the accounts for the streaming services that were all bundled under my card, and I canceled every single one, not with a flounce. Not with a text, just a quiet click and a confirmation, and then I went into my email and removed their addresses from the profiles so that when the cancellation notices went out there would be no warning and no easy reset. Which is petty if you see it in isolation and entirely appropriate if you understand it as the sharp tap before surgery that lets the patient know they are not in charge. Packing after that felt different, less like retreat and more like deliberate movement, because with each box I made a copy of any document that had my name tied to their address. I photographed every envelope with the balance I had covered. And I slid the photos into a folder labeled simply Household on my drive, not as ammunition for a fight, but as the skeleton of the truth if anyone asked me for it, and I told myself that if no one asked, I would never bring it up. Because the point was not to humiliate them, the point was to stop lying on their behalf by continuing a system that worked only because I refused to call it by its real name. By late afternoon, my mom knocked softly and did that cheerful tone people use when they want to seem reasonable, asking if I needed boxes and reminding me that being independent would be good for everyone, and I smiled back and said I was set. And I watched the brief flicker across her face when she realized I was not going to argue or plead or present receipts, and I knew right then that the quiet would scare them more than anger ever could, which is when my phone buzzed with a notification that the first cancellation email had landed in her inbox, and I pictured her opening it and frowning and telling herself it was a mistake she could fix later, which was perfect, because that was exactly how they handled everything. Later. Until later was a wall. I did one more thing before I zipped the suitcase. I logged into the utility portals, and I did not end the autopays yet, because that move had to land at the exact moment it would be understood without a single word. But I did remove the backup payment method, and I changed the account notifications to my email only, so that whatever alarms went off next would ring in my pocket first. And then I set an early alarm for the morning, and I wrote on a sticky note a single line I wanted to say exactly once, with no elaboration and no argument, when I told them I was leaving and what I had done, a line that was neither apology nor attack, just a boundary that would stand no matter how they pushed. They think they can rewrite the story, I thought, tucking the note into my wallet where it would press against my ID like a quiet oath, and then I laughed to myself, because the thing about stories is the person paying the bill is usually the one holding the pen. And I was done pretending I wasn't the author. I woke up before dawn not because I am one of those people who loves mornings, but because I wanted to move before anyone else started performing their usual roles, and I got sucked back into answering questions I did not owe. So I made coffee, opened my laptop, and lined up the tabs I had already rehearsed in my head: the power company, the water utility, the internet provider, the little home security subscription my dad insisted on because it made him feel in control, and I sat there for a full minute just looking at the login screens and letting my pulse slow down, because I knew that once I clicked through and started cutting the cords I had tied myself, there was no gentle way to backtrack without telling them that the rules had changed. And the truth is I wanted the change to be undeniable, not cruel, not vindictive, just impossible to dodge. I started with electricity, because that is the heartbeat you feel when you flip a switch out of muscle memory and nothing happens, and I went into the autopay settings and ended the recurring payment with a calm that surprised me. Then I deleted the stored card. Then I removed the backup account they never knew existed, and finally I toggled the notifications to send to my email only, which meant any warning that came next would land with me first, not so I could fix it, but so I could witness the exact moment the mask slipped, and I took a screenshot of the confirmation screen and dropped it into the quiet folder labeled Household, just in case someone later tried to claim I had never actually supported them in the first place. Because people who reinvent history do not stop just because the power blinks. Water was next, and as I ended that autopay, I remembered the first time I took it over, my mother crying about the late notice and me saying it was fine. I had it, and meaning it because I did. Because at that time helping felt like a shared task rather than a trap, and I let myself feel sad for the younger version of me who believed the help would earn respect. Then I moved to the internet account with a steadiness I had to practice, because I knew this one would sting in a way they would feel in their bones, and I canceled the contract scheduled at the end of the current cycle and sent a disconnect order for the modem return, which was petty if you measured it against a fantasy of perfect forgiveness and perfectly appropriate if you measured it against 8 years of being the invisible scaffolding under people who performed generosity while standing on my shoulders. By the time the sun pushed a dull glow through the blinds, I had closed every loop worth closing, deleted every credit card from every profile, and left in place only one thing that I had decided to keep until the exact moment I spoke, which was the security subscription, not because I wanted to pay even one more month for something they casually demanded, but because I wanted them to feel, when it went dark too, that the lights and the lock and the stream of noise they filled the house with had been connected all along to the same hand, mine, and that I was withdrawing that hand without a speech, and it was in that mood that I started packing in earnest, not in a flurry, not with dramatics. Just folding my life into boxes in a way that felt methodical enough to calm my nerves and decisive enough to make me smile. I took my time with the small things people forget matter, the legal documents, the spare keys, the backups of family photos that had been sitting on my hard drive because I was the only person in the house who actually backed anything up. And I left a copy of those photos on a cheap thumb drive on the kitchen counter with a handwritten note that said simply, "These are yours," because I am not interested in revenge that burns everything indiscriminately. I am interested in the kind that leaves a clear shape of what happened and why, and shows that I know exactly where the line is and have no interest in stepping over it just to make a point. Around mid-morning, my mother wandered in wearing that brittle politeness she uses when she wants to be seen as reasonable, and she asked if I needed anything from the store, as if last night had been a misunderstanding and we were just moving toward a normal weekend, and I said I was good and that I would be out by the end of the weekend as requested, and when she started to rehearse a little speech about how this was healthy for everyone, I held up my hand gently and said I did not need a pep talk, I just needed space, and then I added, in the same clear tone I had written on the sticky note I kept in my wallet, that I had ended the direct payments for their utilities as of this morning and returned every subscription to their control so they could decide what they actually wanted to pay for, because I would no longer be deciding that for them. There is a particular silence that follows a statement someone does not want to process, and it filled the kitchen like steam off a pot, and then my mother frowned and asked, "What do you mean ended?" And I said exactly what it sounded like. That the accounts were no longer tied to my card, that they would receive the usual bills in their own names and could handle them however they saw fit, and I added, because I wanted the truth to be clean, that I had kept receipts in case anyone later suggested I had never done as much as I claimed, not as a threat, not as evidence I planned to use, just to signal that the era of pretending I owed them silence had ended along with the withdrawals. She tried the first angle she always tries, which is gentle guilt, asking where I expected them to find the money on short notice and reminding me that family looks out for each other, and I said I agreed. Which is why I had looked out for them for 8 years and was now looking out for myself, and when that did not land, she reached for anger, asking if I was doing this to punish them, and I said no. I was doing it because I would not continue to finance people who called me dependent in front of their friends, and the way her mouth tightened told me she understood exactly what I was referring to, which meant the conversation was already over even if she did not want it to be. I carried a box past her to the car and noticed that my hands were steady, which felt like a small miracle. And as I came back for the next one, my phone buzzed with a notification that the internet provider had issued a service end date and modem return instructions. And seconds later, I heard my father in the living room swear under his breath as the television hiccuped and threw up an error about connectivity, and I cannot pretend I did not feel a flash of satisfaction there, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I wanted the physical world to reflect the truth I had been speaking, which is that the comfort they enjoyed had been paid for by the person they had just called a burden. They followed me onto the porch with overlapping questions and small accusations and offers to work something out, and I said calmly that there was nothing to work out, that they had asked me to leave and I was leaving, that I had handled my end of the responsibilities and they would handle theirs, and that I hoped, genuinely, they would be fine, because I was not interested in a feud, I was interested in a clean break, and when my dad said, "You cannot do this to us right now," I met his eyes and said, "I did not do this to you. I stopped doing it for you," and then I put the last box in the trunk and closed it with a soft click that felt like a door closing on a chapter one should have ended years ago. I had not even reached the end of the block when my phone started lighting up with calls from their numbers, and then from my aunt, and then from my cousin, which told me the family group chat had woken up and someone was already shaping a version of events. And I let the calls roll to voicemail because there is a kind of peace in not arguing with a story that is still being written by people who do not know the ending, and I drove to the small apartment I had lined up weeks ago just in case this day ever came, and I carried my boxes up 2 flights of stairs and set them down in a room that smelled like fresh paint and possibility, and as I stood there catching my breath, my screen lit with a final notification that made me smile. A politely worded email from the power company addressed to the account holder at my parents' address, informing them that automatic payments had been discontinued and that a manual payment would be required to avoid interruption of service, which meant the clock was now ticking in a way they could not ignore. I put my phone face down on the counter, poured water into a glass, and told myself that whatever came next, I would not explain, I would not negotiate, I would not argue my own reality back into existence for people who had just tried to evict it. And then, just as I took a sip, the screen lit again with a text from an unknown number that made my stomach drop and then harden, a message that said, "We need to talk about what you told everyone," which meant the real game had finally started. The text came from a number I did not recognize, but the tone was familiar, that clipped urgency people use when they believe they are owed a hearing and a handover at the same time. And when I replied asking who it was, the dots blinked without a name until my aunt finally identified herself and launched into a paragraph that tried to sound neutral but could not hide the part where she said my parents were in crisis because I had walked out without warning, which was almost funny if you ignored the years of warnings I swallowed. So I said I was sorry she had been given a partial story, and then asked a single question that I repeated to every person who called after her, whether they knew I had paid the power, the water, and the internet for nearly a decade while being told I was dependent, and the silence that followed that question was better than any speech I could have made, because silence is where people admit to themselves that they have not asked basic questions before. Choosing sides. The calls multiplied in a way that would have been overwhelming if I had not already decided I would not explain beyond that one line. With a cousin telling me I should be kind because New Year's is not the time to make drastic changes, and a family friend hinting that I might be struggling emotionally and projecting, and in each case I said I appreciated the concern and repeated the question. Did you know who has been paying these essentials? And if they said they did not, I suggested they ask my parents and call me back, which a few actually did, and by mid-afternoon the tone of the calls changed from scolding to cautious, with one cousin lower his voice like we were in on a secret and admitting that my parents had often said they were helping me get back on my feet, which had led people to assume I was living rent-free and resisting adult responsibilities, and when I asked whether my parents had ever mentioned specific bills in their names being paid by me, he said of course not. And that was the moment I stopped feeling defensive and started feeling surgical. I opened the folder on my desktop and pulled a few clean screenshots that showed the autopay settings and the transaction histories without revealing anything personal beyond the obvious. And I texted them to exactly 2 people I trusted to be discreet only in the sense that they would not twist my words, but not in the sense that they would keep the truth quiet. My cousin with the auditor's brain and my mother's sister who has a low tolerance for performative generosity, and I told them I was not asking them to intervene, but that, since my name had been circulated in a version of events that made me look like a freeloader, I needed at least 2 people in the family to have a grip on the facts in case things got louder than I planned. And both of them replied within minutes with the kind of clipped anger that shows up when someone realizes they have been sold an inverted story for years. It did not take long for a new wave of messages to arrive, this time from my mother and father back to back, accusing me of airing private family matters and threatening to fix the damage I had caused, which I read twice to make sure I was not misinterpreting the audacity, and I answered in one sentence that I had shared nothing personal, only corrected a public lie about my dependents with proof of my contributions, and that from here on I would not respond to group chat performances or to side messages that boiled down to moving the goalposts. And when my mother tried the wounded tone that had hooked me so many times in the past, I recognized the tug and let it pass. Because recognition without action is a trap, and I was done being polite inside a lie that demanded my money and my silence in equal amounts. What I did not expect was the church angle, which appeared in my inbox by way of a polite note from a deacon I barely know asking if I could confirm some details about my transition. Because my parents had requested short-term assistance and framed it as an emergency created by my abrupt departure, and even though I do not attend regularly and have zero appetite for public drama, I could feel the line they had decided to cross, because the ask was not for help, which I would never begrudge anyone. The ask was for help under a premise that erased 8 years of my support and painted me as the problem, so I took a breath, wrote a concise and respectful reply stating that I had provided direct financial support for essential utilities for many years and had ended those payments after being told to leave the home, and attached the same clean screenshots without commentary. Not to shame them, but to prevent the church from allocating benevolence funds under false pretenses, and I closed with a sentence that said I wished my parents well but would not be participating in any further discussions about me, and within an hour the deacon responded with a promise to pause the request and review, which I knew would land exactly where it needed to land. Not on a public bulletin board, but in the small circle my parents value most, because it props up their image of themselves as the generous, beleaguered ones. By evening the house of cards had started to buckle in that quiet way you only notice if you stop performing and watch, with my father leaving me a voicemail about how embarrassed he was that these people were now asking questions, and my mother sending a message that ricocheted between accusation and pleading, claiming she never meant to make me look bad and begging me to undo what I did, which was a perfect phrase, because it revealed that she understood I had not created anything. I had uncovered what already existed, and in that moment the last thread of guilt snapped and something colder and clearer took its place, not cruelty, just a calm readiness to finish what I had started in a way that would not need a second act. I sat at the little table in my new place and sketched the shape of an ending I could live with, one that did not involve shouting or public brawls or the kind of bitterness that poisons everything nearby. And I realized that the only move that would stick without making me feel like I had become the thing I hated was a simple, undeniable alignment of story and reality in the one setting where my parents have always curated their image the hardest, which is their beloved family brunches where they play hosts and talk about doing the right thing while enjoying comforts I had quietly underwritten. So I waited, because I suspected there would be one scheduled, and right on cue a message hit the family thread announcing a New Year brunch to come together and reset. The kind of phrasing that tells you someone is gearing up to retake control of a narrative with smiles and small speeches. I replied that I would be there briefly and that I had something to drop off, which sent a little tremor through the messages as people tried to decode whether I was coming to make a scene, and I wrote my cousin privately that I would not be raising my voice. I would not be making accusations. I would only be speaking once and leaving, and he sent back a single line that said, "Say the thing no one can spin," which was exactly the plan, and, because a good ending depends on timing, I opened the remaining account I still held, the home security subscription my father loved to brag about, and scheduled the cancellation for the exact morning of their brunch with a quiet confirmation that would unlock the front door from their phones and send a very specific chime through the house just as people were arriving, a chime that says, in a voice no one can argue with, that the person paying the bill has left the building. I closed the laptop, slid the cancellation confirmation into the folder with the others, and set my alarm for early Sunday so I could arrive with a calm face and a single sentence. And as I turned off the light in my small, quiet place, my phone buzzed one more time with a message from my mother that read, "Please, do not embarrass us tomorrow," which made me smile because it told me she still believed this was about performance, when in reality it was about a final, simple truth spoken once in a room full of people who would finally hear it without me raising my voice. And when I whispered to myself the line I planned to use, it felt like a key turning in a lock I had been carrying for years, and I knew I was ready. Sunday arrived with that heavy quiet that settles before a conversation everyone has been rehearsing in their head, and I drove over without music and without a speech because I had learned that the cleanest truth needs no decoration, just timing and one complete sentence. So I walked in with a neutral hello, set a small paper bag on the sideboard with the modem and a note about the return label, and before plates were even passed, the phones around the room vibrated with the same notification from the security app announcing that remote access had been terminated due to a canceled subscription, which sent a small wave of confusion through the chatter that my mother tried to chase down with a bright announcement about family and fresh starts. And that was my cue to stand, lift my glass of water, and say that I would keep this very short because I was not here to argue or defend or perform. I was here to return what was never my responsibility and to correct one false story that had swallowed 8 years of my life. I said that for nearly a decade I had paid the electricity, the water, the internet, the security system, and several other small services that kept this house running. That I had done it quietly and directly because I believed that is what you do when your parents ask for help. And that I had continued even when the narrative in this very room flipped me into the role of a dependent guest rather than the person underwriting the basics, and that when I was told on New Year's Eve to find somewhere else to live and to stop relying on them, I took that instruction seriously. Which is why accounts tied to my card no longer exist, and why the church will not be processing an emergency request that was filed under a version of events that left out my name and my payments. And then I paused long enough for the words to land without me repeating them, because repetition is a kind of pleading, and I was done pleading. My father started to interrupt with something about timing and consideration. My mother tried to say that I was taking things out of context, and I held up my hand and said that I would not be taking questions. That anyone who wanted context could check the auto-pay histories and the deacon's inbox and the customer service logs because they paint a simple picture without commentary, and that I was not angry, I was finished, which is a very different thing. And a cousin who had called me the day before let out an involuntary breath that sounded like someone who finally recognized the shape of the room they were in, and I felt the last of my nerves settle, because this was not about humiliating anyone. It was about setting the floor under my own feet and refusing to let it be ripped away again by a story that felt convenient for everyone but me. I reached into my bag and took out 2 envelopes, each with a printout of the last 12 months of payments redacted to protect my account details. And I handed one to my father and one to my mother and said I was giving them these not to shame them, but so that when they talked to people later they would not have to guess. And I added, because clarity is mercy when people like to wobble, that I had removed my card from every account, had canceled or transferred every service I owned, had boxed and returned every device, and would not be answering any more group messages or private appeals, and that if they needed help in the future they should ask each other or the appropriate offices directly, because I was no longer the first call, the backup plan, or the person on hold with customer service while being called dependent in the next room. Someone at the table asked gently if there was any path to reconciliation, and I said I was not closing the door on contact. I was closing the door on financing a lie. And that if my parents wanted a relationship based on honesty and mutual respect, they would know exactly where to find me, but that I would not meet them in any room where the price of entry was my silence about what I had actually done. And I ended it there because the point of a boundary is that it is not a debate, it is a line you draw for yourself and hold without raising your voice. So I set down my glass and picked up the small bag with the modem return instructions and placed it in my mother's hands. And when she whispered my name in that tone I have always been trained to run to, I kissed her cheek once, said take care of yourselves, and stepped back so that the space between us could finally tell the truth that words had refused to carry. I did not wait for the apologies that came in half sentences or the explanations about pride and embarrassment that my father started piecing together, and I did not stay for the part where extended family tried to smooth it over with jokes and stories. I simply thanked the hosts for the meal they had not yet served, told my aunt I would call her later in the week, squeezed my cousin's shoulder, and left before anyone could transform my exit into a scene they could later call hysterical, and in the car I sat for a minute with my phone in my lap because I knew it would begin buzzing with a new wave of messages, and I wanted to decide whether I would answer any of them, and I chose, finally, to send one text to the family thread that said, in plain words, that I loved my parents, that I would not be discussing finances again, that the accounts were closed, that I wished them well, and that I would be off for a week to settle into my place, and then I turned the phone off and drove to the apartment that already felt like a decision made right. In the days that followed there were the expected ripples, the attempted rewrites, the half-apologies that felt like probes to see if I would resume my old role if only the tone softened, and there were also the unexpected quiet acknowledgments. A message from the deacon saying the assistance request had been withdrawn and that he was praying for clarity for everyone involved. A call from my mother's sister asking to meet for coffee without an agenda, and a photo from my cousin of my parents at the utility office with a caption that was not gloating, just factual, that they were setting up their own payments like adults. And I looked at that photo for a long time because it was the first time in years that reality and story matched without me standing between them like a translator who never gets credit for the job. I will not pretend there was no grief, because there was, the kind that slips in during quiet hours and asks you whether drawing the line means you are a bad daughter, and I answered that question each time by reminding myself that I did not cut them off from love. I cut them off from a free ride that came packaged with my silence, and those are not the same thing, and I decided that if reconciliation ever comes it will be because they want a relationship that does not require me to disappear inside it, and until then I will build a life that does not run on crisis alerts from a house where my name only shows up in whispered complaints and emergency requests. When people ask how it ended, I say it ended the way it should have started, with the truth on the table and the bills in the right hands, with me paying for my life and them paying for theirs, with their friends and their church and their relatives adjusting to a reality that had been true for years, but hidden to keep a story alive, and with me choosing peace over performance, which, as it turns out, feels suspiciously like victory, not because I hurt them, but because I refuse to keep hurting myself to protect their comfort. And if that sounds harsh to anyone listening, I invite them to imagine 8 years of quiet payments and one night of being called a burden, and then tell me they would have done anything different, because I know what I did, and I know why. And I sleep just fine.